Well, I appreciate the patience of anyone in room 135B in West Block and any reporters currently on the line. As you heard, we've had some technical difficulties connecting. Malheureusement, cette conférence de presse maintenant est prête pour commencer. And I'm very grateful to people who've waited and people who've been helping me. Je suis vraiment désolée. C'est un outrage. Comme chef de parti vert, quelqu'un qui a travaillé sur la question du changement climatique et pour protéger l'environnement et la santé des Canadiens il y a quelques décennies. Alors, cet protocole d'accord entre Ottawa et Alberta est pire que je peux imaginer. We knew we had a lot of advance notice that there would be some kind of memorandum of understanding between the government of Alberta and Premier Daniel Smith and Prime Minister Mark Carney. But this is simply unimaginable. This is a betrayal of so many different values, so many different agreements, so many different orders of rights and existing Canadian law. It completely sets the stage for the complete abandonment of Canada's climate policy. It is simply shocking. So I will go through in short order major concerns and then be available for any questions anyone has. And I think, of course, you're all hearing the responses from British Columbia First Nations, coastal peoples of British Columbia, as well as Canadians from coast to coast. What this accord does is give a fast track to massive industrial projects, some of which are unlikely to work, but waste a lot of money, some of which may work, but will not help the climate crisis, and others that simply make no sense. Maintenant, c'est un protocole d'accord entre Ottawa et Alberta, c'est vraiment un grand cadeau vers l'industrie nucléaire, l'industrie d'énergie fossile, vers quelques groupes des industries, mais pas pour les peuples autochtones. C'est une violation des droits dans la Constitution du Canada, puis aussi dans quelques autres accords partout au Canada. We're looking at an agreement. Let's start with the things that don't make sense. Just on November 17th, the Prime Minister confirmed in the House of Commons, in response to my question, not just to me, but to all Canadians, a commitment to the Paris Agreement to stay as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible. This agreement is premised on net zero by 2050, as though they are the same things. They are not. Net zero by 2050 is a fraud. It always has been, because in order to avoid catastrophic impacts from the climate crisis, emissions need to be reduced quite sharply. And yesterday, but certainly the date limite de 2050, c'est pas acceptable parce que c'est dans l'avenir et très loin à l'avenir. It's too far in the future. 2050 is not a date that shows up in the Paris Agreement at all. We are committed as a country to 40 to 45% reductions below 2005 levels by 2035. So everything about this agreement, the notion of net zero, la notion de zéro d'ici 2050, ce n'est pas une cible acceptée, ce n'est pas une cible dans l'accord de Paris. So that's the first point. We need to ensure we're meeting international law, which is the Paris Agreement. But for that matter, we also have to meet domestic law, because Canada has the so-called Net Zero Accountability Act that requires that Canada have emission reductions by 2035. The plan to achieve those under domestic law is due in February 2026. This blows a hole through all of that if we were serious about building an oil pipeline to expand production of the dirtiest of forms of oil which is bitumen from the oil sands of Alberta. It is also absurd in that it speaks of something that can't exist. And what can't exist is a bitumen pipeline. I say that not as a political statement, but as a physical reality, that bitumen is a solid and can't flow through a pipeline. That's why the substance that moves through the Trans Mountain pipeline isn't solid bitumen, but diluted bitumen, which makes it a far more dangerous substance and makes it impossible to clean up in the marine environment. So I don't know why any written document signed by a prime minister and a premier would refer to a bitumen pipeline. But for a moment, imagine they actually want to move solid bitumen to the BC coast. That's easy. The infrastructure exists now. If you want to move bitumen as a solid, like a lump of tar, which is what it is, you put it on a train where it's completely safe. It's not like Back and Shell that blew up in Lac Mégantic. Put it on a train or a truck, ship it to a container ship. It doesn't pose a risk because bitumen can neither catch fire nor spill. Just as a note of interest, of the diluted bitumen that now leaves Burnaby from the Trans Mountain pipeline and is shipped to China, on arrival at any port, whether dilbit, whether going to China or the US or wherever, the first thing they do is take out the diluent, which is a mix of chemicals, basically fossil fuel condensate, that makes the bitumen, once stirred in, capable of flowing through a pipeline. At any place of destination, they take out the diluent because it's not a product upgrade. It's only there to get the solid bitumen to flow through a pipeline. So about a third of the bitumen from Alberta that now reaches China is used to pave roads because it is essentially tar. It's not essentially crude oil until it is upgraded and then goes through a refinery to become a fossil fuel product like gasoline. Just to make these points, because I wonder how they could decide that they want to call it a bitumen pipeline. If it's a pipeline, it's a dilbit pipeline. And dilbit is inherently more dangerous in transit. And if it spills, it is literally impossible to clean up in the marine environment. So the tanker ban that was enacted on the BC coast as a voluntary understanding between the federal government and BC government when the prime minister was Pierre Trudeau in 1972, that wasn't motivated by climate action, obviously. In 1972, that was motivated to protect the BC coastline from a major oil tanker spill, such as was experienced a couple of years later in Alaska with Exxon Valdez. This is a nonsense. It is also a nonsense to say that the Pathways project, once completed, will be successful in containing carbon dioxide and sequestering it from the environment. Carbon capture and storage is notoriously hugely expensive and not particularly effective. On top of that technology, they're betting on a technology that is both expensive and not particularly effective. They've also put real push behind the idea that Alberta is going to go nuclear. And they've also, of course, in assuming that they can go across BC with a dilbit pipeline against the wishes of the people of British Columbia and against the rights of title holders, First Nations, whose rights are entrenched in Section 35 of our Constitution, as well as in Canada's acceding to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At every level, this is an abomination, and I'm afraid that Prime Minister Mark Carney and Premier Daniel Smith will find that no matter Daniel Smith saying in the press conference today that this memorandum of understanding does not give a veto to the province of British Columbia or any province or anyone else, if Premier of Alberta Daniel Smith thinks that First Nations in this country don't have constitutionally enshrined protected rights and that there aren't enough bulldozers in this world to stop the determination of British Columbia coastal First Nations to say, no damn way are you crossing British Columbia again with a dilbit pipeline to create more tanker traffic, to threaten our marine environment and billions of dollars worth of industry on our coastline, our fishery, our tourism. But beside putting dollar signs on it, our rights and the rights of our children and grandchildren to have an existence in a planet that's habitable without a vast increase, not only in fossil fuel production, but fossil fuel burning, and a threat to the future of human civilization. So I read this memorandum of understanding expecting to see concern, expecting to think they're going to offer the possibility of a pipeline if they can find a private sector proponent. But there's far more in here that is stated as the federal government will ensure Alberta can do the following things. And we have to make it very, very clear. Green Party will make it clear. The British Columbia Green Party has already made it clear, as have the First Nations. I saw the statement of Hereditary Chief of the Haida Nation, Gujau. If the BC government and the federal government of Canada think that this is a doable thing, they are wrong, misinformed, and it's a nonsense to imagine that untested, expensive technologies like carbon capture and storage are going to make it possible to build a pipeline loaded with diluted bitumen. As I said, no objections from me, loaded on a train, ship it to the Port of Vancouver, stick bitumen in container ships, and send it wherever you want. But don't you dare think you're going to put a pipeline loaded with diluted bitumen across the BC coast and increase the number of tankers on our coastlines. I call on all British Columbia MPs, particularly coastal MPs, particularly Liberals who never ran on this. Stand up now and protect British Columbia, protect First Nations rights, show some solidarity, show some backbone. Je suis disponible pour les questions en anglais ou en français. Ça, c'est mon réaction à le protocole d'accord entre Madame Smith and Monsieur Carney.
We will start with the questions inside the room, Ms. May, and then if there are questions online, please just raise your hand and I'll get to you after the questions in 135.
Hi, Ms. May. This is Lisa Mayer from CBC News. Thanks for doing this today. We've just heard that Stephen Guilbeault is resigning cabinet. He's staying on as a Liberal MP, and he's already spoken to the Prime Minister. As someone who is a longtime friend and colleague of yours since about 1992, I think you said, I'm just hoping to get your reaction to that in French and English, please.
Je suis vraiment déçu que Stephen Guilbeault a fait sa décision, parce que c'est le moment clé, que ce n'est pas un seul espoir pour le gouvernement de M. Carney à l'avenir. With Stephen in cabinet, one would hope that the Prime Minister might listen. If Stephen Guilbeault, and you've just told me the news I hadn't heard before, Stephen Guilbeault leaving cabinet dashes the last hope that Mark Carney is going to have a good climate record ever. J'invite maintenant, j'exige, Stephen, s'il vous plaît, joignez Parti Vert. We need strong climate members of parliament, because if there is not a party in parliament that's a recognized party large enough to create a new political dynamic in this country, so far, Prime Minister Mark Carney has tacked right, taking Poilievre's policies and embracing them as government policies. Without a strong party that's progressive to create some counterbalance in a minority parliament, we won't get better. We can get better with more Liberal MPs standing up for climate, joining us, and creating a new force in the Canadian political scene. Parce que je respecte énormément la décision de mon ami de longue date, Stephen Guilbeault, mais je suis tellement triste parce qu'avec sa décision, c'est clair que si il a décidé qu'il n'est pas en raison de rester dans le cabinet de notre Premier ministre. So if Stephen Guilbeault has given up on Mark Carney, don't give up on democracy, don't give up on climate action. Join us. Now's the time.
And another follow-up quickly for you. Do you think the Prime Minister lied to you on November 17th when he committed to the Paris Climate Accord?
No, I don't. I don't think to stay far below 2 degrees is possible. It may be that he imagines that he has techno fantasies, that it's doable without doing the right thing now, and that we can somehow make up for lost time later. I don't like to accuse people of lying, but his actions are reckless, and he is not considering what this MOU does to any hope of Canada keeping the Paris Agreement targets that he committed publicly and clearly. And I negotiated for my vote to have that public, clear commitment to hold to Paris Agreement, which is not net zero by 2050, to repeat. Je veux souligner que l'accord de Paris n'était pas pour zéro d'ici à 2050, pas du tout. C'est de garder l'augmentation par 2 degrees Celsius and to stay as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible. That's the Paris target. So it may be, who knows what was in his head when he said it, so I don't accuse people of lying. But I say right now and clearly, the actions in this MOU, if they maintain that this is what they're going to do and they don't rip it up tomorrow, they've sold out all of Canada and our future and a stable climate for future generations if they pursue this course to satisfy Daniel Smith and ignore Premier David Eby, ignore the First Nations across this country, because it's not just British Columbia First Nations that want to stop climate crisis. First Nations of Manitoba and Saskatchewan that had to leave their homes all summer because of wildfires. This is unconscionable.
No, that's all. Thanks.
All right, so that's it for the questions in the room. There are no questions on Zoom, so we'll conclude the press conference. Thank you very much, Ms. May.
Merci tout le monde. Désolé pour que je suis en retard un peu, mais je reste disponible pour les autres interviews. Merci. And thank you to all the Press Gallery Tech team for helping me out here. I don't know. But maybe the technology resort was also reacting to the protocol d'accord. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a nice night.